Well, I don't know about you, but I love me some Jason Adams. How about that, huh? Wow, 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 wow. He grew up in this church, and then he wandered off. Shame on him. No, he's doing a lot of good things, and we're just fortunate to get him every so often. So you pray with me that we get him more often than that. Yeah, I see you over there. Anyway, good morning. I'm so glad you're here as we begin this new three-part series. And as we get started, I want to remind you of something we talk about often around here at Springbrook, because at Springbrook, we've been called to not simply believe things, but to do things. In other words, faith is meant to be lived. Following Jesus isn't just about what we know or say we believe. It changes the way we live, love, serve, and care for others. It has the power to make our lives better and the world around us better. It can strengthen our families, deepen our relationships, and bring hope to our communities. And when Jesus stepped onto the scene, this is exactly what drew people to him then, and it still brings us together today. He said, "The kingdom of God has come because the king has come, and everyone is invited to be a part of this brand new kingdom." So no matter where you are in your faith journey, right, whether you followed Jesus for years, or maybe you're still exploring, or you're still kind of unsure, you're welcome here, because that's what we represent and what we're about at Springbrook. So as we begin this new series today, I want to start with something I think all of us can relate to, and I'm not sure that I've ever explained this very well, but I'm going to try it again today, so here's my next shot at it. If someone asks you to tell the story of your life, right, there are a lot of different ways you could tell it. You could tell it through the lens of your family. You could tell it through the places that you've lived. You could tell it through the opportunities you've had, the work you've done, the experiences that shaped you. But if somebody actually asks you to tell your story, and let's be honest, right, that doesn't happen very often unless maybe you're in a small group, which is one of the reasons small groups can be so meaningful. But here's the deal. You probably wouldn't stay in just one lane. You'd probably start in one place and then move to another. You might say, I was born here into this family, I went to this school, and then I met someone special, we moved to a different city, we had kids, I changed jobs. And as you tell your story, you naturally move back and forth between those different parts of life. We all do that. Sometimes our stories include moments of joy and opportunity. Sometimes they include seasons of illness and loss, divorce, disappointment, or even tragedy. Because of all those moments, both the good and the extremely difficult become a part of the story that we tell about who we are. But there's one lane we almost never choose when we tell our story. And honestly, it might be the most revealing of all. What if instead of telling your story through the events that happened to you, you told it rather through your responses to those events? Your responses to your family, your responses to opportunities, right? Your responses to illness, disappointment, success, tragedy, change, or even moving from one place to another. I mean, that kind of story would be interesting. It would be honest. And if we're being real this morning, it would also be, right, incredibly vulnerable. Because when you think about it, our responses to what happens around us are often the part of our story we actually have some control over. Right? Most of us don't usually think in terms of responses. Rather, we think in terms of decisions, like I decided this or I chose that. But really, a decision is simply a response to the options, circumstances, and experiences we're given. And if you think about the events of our lives as dots, things we often didn't choose and couldn't control, then your responses and my responses are what connect those dots. And this helps explain why two people can come from very similar backgrounds, face the same challenges or the same opportunities, and still end up in very different places in life. You've probably seen that happen, maybe with your friends, maybe with your siblings, maybe even right in your own family. Two people can experience the same dysfunction, the same hardship, the same opportunity to move beyond it, and yet respond in completely different ways. Right? One response, right, can lead towards healing, growth, and hope, and another one can lead in a very different direction. The circumstances may have been almost identical, but the responses were not. And over time, those responses shaped where their lives went. But there's even more to it, and this matters for where we're going to go in this series. Not only do our responses connect the dots of what happens in our lives, our responses also influence what the next dot looks like. They shape the next opportunity, the next relationship, the next challenge, and sometimes even the direction of our future. Now, there may be exceptions, and you're smart enough to think of some, but for the most part, our lives are shaped by the way we respond to what comes our way. In many ways, we are no better or better off than our responses because our responses directly affect the direction of our lives. Think about it this way. Our responses are kind of like the steering wheel of our lives, and that means our ability to respond is actually one of our greatest strengths. In fact, we could call it a superpower because it's our ability to respond that gives us the power to choose how we move forward when life presents us with challenges, opportunities, disappointments, or change. And this matters no matter what life brings our way, right? Your responsibility empowers you to choose a response rather than having a response dictated to you by circumstances. And this superpower gives you the ability to respond thoughtfully instead of simply reacting automatically. And that's an important difference because, reacting positions us to become a reflection. In other words, when we only react, it's like holding up a mirror to whatever is happening around us. We begin to absorb it and repeat it and reflect it. And before long, we can start to mirror the people we don't want to become. We can begin to reflect the anger, fear, dysfunction, or hurt that actually came our way. To simply react is to let our circumstances take control. But choosing our response gives us the opportunity to move forward in a different direction. But get this, a measured response is different. It creates space between what happens to us and what we choose to do next. And this may be especially important for somebody sitting in this room or somebody watching us online because a measured response ensures that you don't become like someone you don't like. Your response gives you the power to turn something bad into something good. It gives you the ability to interpret the harmful intentions of others, A measured response can help redeem pain, break unhealthy generational patterns, and it can even change the direction of your life or the life of someone you love. A measured response is powerful. It changes far more than we even realize, which raises this question. If it's so powerful, why don't we use this superpower more often? And this is where our faith becomes especially important. You see, the response that has the potential to reverse the natural course of things isn't natural. In other words, the kind of response that truly changes things is rarely the most obvious or instinctive response. The response that can change a relationship, a family, or even a future is often the unexpected one. And that's the kind of life that Jesus invited people into. So even if you're here in the room or joining us online, even if you're still exploring faith, there's something so compelling about the way Jesus taught people to respond with grace instead of revenge, forgiveness instead of bitterness, courage instead of fear, generosity instead of selfishness. And for the people listening to Jesus in his day, this sounded almost impossible. And honestly, sitting here this morning, it still does. I mean, who says things like, love your enemy? I mean, that doesn't sound natural at all. When we realize that someone is against us, our instinct usually isn't to love them. Our instinct is to react, to defend ourselves, to get even, to push back, or even cut them off completely. But Jesus says, love your enemies. And then there's this one. Pray for those who mistreat you. If we're honest, most of us struggle to pray consistently for the people we care about, much less for people who have hurt us. Our natural reaction when someone mistreats us is usually to mistreat them back, talk about them, avoid them, or hold on to resentment. But Jesus says, pray for them. Not pray against them, not pray they get what's coming to them. Pray for them. Pray for their healing, their future, their good. I mean, come on, who does that? That's not a reaction. That's a measured, intentional response. And then Jesus teaches us, how about this one, to forgive. I mean, when someone hurts us or hurts someone we love, our instinct is not usually forgiveness, it's retaliation, it's anger. It's wanting them to feel what we feel. But Jesus says that's exactly why you and I need a different way, because a measured response has the power to stop things instead of spreading them. It can stop bitterness. It can stop division. It can stop cycles of hurt. It can stop pain from moving from one person to the next. In fact, you've probably heard this phrase right here, turn the other cheek, even if you didn't know that it was Jesus who said it. And he said that if someone strikes one cheek, turn the other also. And in that culture, it wasn't really about allowing someone to physically hurt you again. It's a way of saying, if someone insults you, don't insult them back. And come on, that is so difficult. It is so unnatural. It's not intuitive. But Jesus says, that is my way. And it's this upside down way of Jesus that changes people, families, schools, communities, and even nations. It's the kind of response that can turn bad into good, break unhealthy cycles, and bring healing where there's been hurt. But because it doesn't come naturally, it's easy to miss. But think about what happens when you actually see someone live this way. When you see someone forgive instead of retaliate. When you see someone refuse to return evil for evil. I mean, when you see someone respond with grace when they had every reason to respond with anger, you don't usually think they're weak. You know what you think? That's incredible. Because deep down, we recognize there's something powerful about that kind of response. And for those of us in this room and online who follow Jesus, we see that as a reflection of who God is. Because God looked at a broken and hurting world and chose not to respond with revenge or rejection. Instead, he responded with love. He sent his son to bring forgiveness, hope, and healing. This is the way of Jesus. It's not weak, it's powerful. It's the kind of response that can change the direction of a life, a family, a city, a group of people, and even a nation. And I don't want us to miss it. So today and over the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about it together. We're going to explore this way of living by taking a deep dive into the Old Testament story of Joseph. Now, if you're new to the Bible, relax. There are actually several people named Joseph in Scripture. You may have heard of the two most well-known Josephs in the Bible, Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, and then Joseph, the one we're going to talk about, the son of Jacob in the Old Testament. And many of you probably know at least part of Joseph's story already. So I'm going to do my best to keep it interesting, because Joseph's story is a testament to the sanity-preserving, course-reversing power of a measured response, or really a series of measured responses. Now, if you know his story, what stands out is not just what happened to him, but how consistently he responded to what happened to him. And that consistency seemed to come from his confidence that God was with him. And what's remarkable is that Joseph had very little visible evidence that God was actually with him, yet he kept living as though God was near. He responded as though God was with him when he was abandoned and alone and powerless and forgotten. And later, when his circumstances changed and he held power over the very people who had hurt him, he still responded as though God was with him then. All right, so here's the context. It's around 2000 BC. God stepped into the brokenness of the world and called a man named Abraham. And God made Abraham this incredible promise. You may have heard it before. He said, Abraham, you're going to become a great nation. Now, the remarkable part is Abraham didn't even have any children at that time. So God told him, listen, you're going to become a nation of people, and through that nation, the whole world would be blessed. Now, if you say, well, big deal, that was a long time ago. Listen, this promise matters to all of us, because whether someone is a person of faith or you're still exploring what you believe, almost everyone has heard the name of Jesus of Nazareth, right? His life, his teaching, and his impact on the world have reached far beyond any culture or generation. And according to the Bible, that influence traces all the way back to the promise God made to Abraham thousands of years earlier. See, God was building a nation that would one day bless the world through Jesus of Nazareth. All right, so back to the story. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob had a very large family, 12 sons and 1 daughter. Now, those children, hang on, came through different relationships. And as you can imagine, that created a lot of tension within the family. And at the center of that tension was the fact that Jacob clearly had a favorite son. That son was Joseph. Joseph was the son of the wife Jacob loved most. Now, let me just pause here. There's a lesson to be learned right here. Guys, don't have a favorite wife, right? Because every time somebody has a favorite wife in the Old Testament, it created all kind of chaos. So guys, if you get nothing out of this message, no favorite wife. So anyway, because of that, Jacob gave Joseph more attention, more affection, and even more gifts than his brothers. And as you can probably imagine, that whole gift-giving thing didn't go so well. Favoritism has a way of creating division in any family, and in Joseph's family, it became the spark that lit the fire. And as many of you may remember, Joseph had this beautiful, expensive coat that his father gave him, a very visible reminder that he was the favorite son. The coat only added to the jealousy and resentment that his brothers already felt. So here's what happened next. Now, when Joseph was 17 years old, which in that culture meant he was considered an adult, his father sent him to check on his brothers while they were out tending sheep far away from home. His brothers saw him coming, and years of jealousy finally boiled over. They were tired of Joseph, tired of the favoritism, tired of feeling like he would always be treated differently, and they decided that they wanted to put an end to it. Now, their first plan was to kill him. They grabbed Joseph, they stripped him of his coat his father had given him, and they threw him in a large pit or cistern. Then they took his coat and they covered it with animal blood and planned to take it back to their father so it would look like that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. Now, that was their intention. But before they followed through, they started debating what to do next, and that's where we're going to pick up the story. Look right up here, Genesis 37:25. As they sat down to eat their meal. Now, let me pause here. These are Joseph's brothers. Joseph is sitting in a nearby pit, and they sit down to eat their McDonald's like nothing has happened, right? And then the text says, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Now, these were merchants traveling to Egypt. Verse 26, Judah, who was one of Joseph's older brothers, said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? In other words, if we kill him, then we're going to spend the rest of our lives hiding what we did. And then Judah says, verse 27, come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother. Now, as strange as that sounds, the brothers thought this was the merciful option, right? Let's not kill him, let's just sell him. So they sold Joseph into slavery, and then they took his coat, right, covered it with animal blood, and brought it back to their father, Jacob. And they told him that they had found it, and that it had looked like that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. And with that lie, they broke their father's heart. But something else happened in that moment, too. These young men didn't just tell a lie. They stepped into a pattern they would have to carry for the rest of their lives, which reminds us of something incredibly important. Don't ever do anything that has the potential to make you a liar for life, right? In other words, if you're tempted to do something and you know you're going to be ashamed to talk about it later, you're on the verge of becoming a liar for life, and that life will follow you throughout your life. And oftentimes, the weight of hiding it can follow you much longer than you would have ever expected. Well, back to the story. The Ishmaelites now have Joseph. He's terrified, right? He doesn't know where they're taking him, and he knows he's being sold as a slave. Then Genesis 39:1 tells us this. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Now, at this point, Joseph knows that no one is coming to rescue him, right? No one's looking for him. No one seems to be watching out for him, or at least that's how it appears. And then the very next verse, verse 2 says, the Lord was with Joseph. Now, I get it. For some of us, that can be hard to understand, right? Maybe you grew up with the idea in your church world, or maybe not going to church, that if God is with you, life should go smoothly. Maybe you were taught that if you had enough faith, things should work out, prayer should be answered the way you want, and suffering should always stay far away. And maybe one of the reasons that you struggle with faith is because you look at the pain and the injustice in the world and you wonder, if God is so good, where is he? I mean, why do bad things happen to people who don't deserve it? Because, right, if God was with Joseph, then Joseph shouldn't have been protected from all of this, right? That's how many people think it works. If God is with you, then nothing bad should happen to you. But that's not the story the Bible tells. The Christian faith is built around the belief that the worst possible thing happened to the best possible person, and God was still present in the middle of it. And through what happened to Jesus came hope, redemption, and salvation for the world. That's the way of God. And somehow, amazingly, Joseph understood this. Even in the middle of fear, betrayal, and uncertainty, he chose to live as though God was with him. He used that superpower, right? He responded as if God was with him. Now, the story continues, Genesis 39:2. It says, the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. Now, I'm just going to say this. I don't think Joseph felt like he was prosperous. He'd been taken from his home, separated from his family, sold as a slave in a foreign land. Joseph had grown up in a wealthy family. He went from being a favored son in his father's house to being owned by someone else. So when the text says he prospered, it doesn't mean everything was suddenly easy or comfortable. It means that even in this difficult place, Joseph continued to move forward. He kept showing up, working hard, and responding faithfully. The verse continues, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. In other words, Joseph's situation improved some. He's no longer working outside in the fields, he's living in the house. That was progress. But remember, he's still a slave. Now, let me pause here. One thing that's important for us to understand about the story is that it can feel like when we read it that everything happened very quickly. I mean, that's the way stories often work. They compress time. You know this, right? You watch a movie on Netflix and someone goes from one season of life to another in a matter of minutes. But in real life, those changes take months or years. The same thing is true here. When we read Joseph's story in Genesis, it can sound like that he arrived in Egypt on Monday, was sold on Tuesday, and by Thursday, he was living in Potiphar's house. But these were not days or even weeks. They were years of Joseph's life, years of waiting, years of uncertainty, years of serving faithfully in circumstances he would have never chosen. That's one reason that the story includes details like Joseph's age. See, we meet him as a 17-year-old, but a lot of time passes as the story unfolds, and during all of those years, Joseph was still a slave. Yet even in that difficult season, people around him begin to notice that there was something different about him. Even Potiphar, his master, could see that somehow God was with him. Potiphar could see there was something different in Joseph. He could see that Joseph worked hard. He managed responsibility well. He carried himself differently than everyone else around him. Look at verse 3, that the Lord gave Joseph success in everything he did. And part of the reason Joseph was successful is because he refused to see himself only as a victim of what happened to him. See, Joseph had every reason to give up, become bitter, or stop trying, but instead, he held on to the belief that even in the middle of everything that he had lost, that God was still with him. So year after year, Joseph kept responding as if God was with him. And eventually, Potiphar noticed, verse 4 says, Joseph found favor in Potiphar's eyes and became his personal attendant. Over time, and probably over many years, Potiphar trusted Joseph more and more. Eventually, he put Joseph in charge of his entire household. Look at verse 5. It says this, Potiphar put him in charge of his household and of all he owned. The Lord blessed Potiphar's household because of Joseph. Now, I don't know, when you read that, there's a little irony there because the blessing Joseph never got to experience in his own home was now being experienced by someone else through him. The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. And while Joseph may not have felt especially blessed himself, God was still working through him in ways he could not fully see. Joseph kept doing the unexpected. In fact, Joseph kept responding as though God was with him, even when it may have felt like God was silent or far away. And really, that's kind of what makes Joseph's story so powerful. He didn't know how his story would end. He didn't know if things would ever get better. He had very little evidence to hang on to, and yet he kept choosing to believe that God was still with him. Now, this is where I want us to lean in just for a moment, okay? Joseph didn't have what we have, right? He didn't have a Bible. He didn't have generations of written history. Think about this. He didn't know about Moses, the Red Sea, David, the prophets, or any of the miracles that would come later. All Joseph had were the stories passed down through his family. Stories from his father Jacob told him about Isaac. Stories Isaac told him about Abraham, and that was it. And somehow, with very little to go on, Joseph chose to trust the God he could not see, even when it may have felt like God had done nothing for him lately. I don't know about you, that's a remarkable faith. And for those of us who follow Jesus, right? We have so much more to go on. We have the story of God's faithfulness throughout the Old Testament. We have the life of Jesus. We have the cross, the resurrection, and the impact Jesus continues to have in the world today. I mean, here we are more than 2,000 years later, people all over the world still gather in places just like this morning to worship Jesus. That is part of the promise God made to Abraham so very long ago. Remember, Jesus promised us, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you. So even when life is difficult, even when circumstances don't make sense, we have reason to believe that God is still with us. And even if you're still exploring faith, there's something powerful about living with the belief that you're not alone, that your life has meaning, and that your circumstances do not get the final word. But to experience that, we have to respond to life as though God is with us. Not a reaction that comes to us because of a reflection of our pain or our fear or our circumstances, but with a measured response that says, in spite of what's happening around me, I'm not alone, I'm not a victim, I'm not without hope, and I do not have to let this moment define me. Which leads us to a question that we're going to come back to throughout this series. How would someone in your circumstances respond if they were confident that God was with them? And here's what I want to encourage you to do, right? Just step back for a moment and look at your life from the outside, as if you were looking at someone else. Imagine looking at a person, right, who has your background, your family story, your disappointments, your opportunities, your challenges, all your unanswered questions. Imagine looking at someone who has what you have, who doesn't have what you don't have, and who's facing exactly what you're facing right now. And then ask, how would someone in that situation respond if they truly believed that God was with them? How would they respond if they believed they were not alone? How would they respond if they believed God was not finished with their story? How would they respond if they believed there was more going on than what they could see right now? Because when you and I begin to ask that question, it can change the way we respond to almost everything. And here's why this question matters so much. And I'm not telling you what to do in every situation. I just want to invite you to pause long enough to really think through it, because your answer to that question becomes an invitation to use your superpower, your ability to respond instead of simply react, right? It becomes an opportunity to do the unexpected thing, to choose a response that doesn't just come naturally, but one that's shaped by trust and wisdom and courage and faith. And sometimes that kind of response is so different that the people around you notice. And it's not so the attention comes to you, but so that people begin to wonder, man, what is different about them? Where do they get that kind of peace and that kind of strength? Where does that restraint come from, right? It's a way of allowing confidence in God, not fear, not pressure, not anger, not circumstances, to change and shape the way we move through life. And this is one of the reasons that the invitation of Jesus is so powerful. Now think about this. I grew up in church, maybe you did too. But they didn't talk about this. They never mentioned this. See, Jesus didn't simply say, try harder. He didn't say, listen, when you get on the parking lot and somebody's trying to get out on Heggs Road and they got their blinker on and they won't move. He doesn't say, manage your reactions better. Keep your fingers all in your pocket. He says, follow me. In other words, watch how I live. Watch how I respond to pressure. Watch how I respond to suffering. Watch how I respond when I'm misunderstood or rejected or mistreated. Watch how I treat people in need. Watch how I respond to people who are arrogant, hurting, confused, or convinced they have all the answers. Jesus invites us to follow him because his way leads us into the life of the measured response. And that kind of response can make all the difference, not only in your life, but in the lives of the people around you and ultimately the world. And here's the thing, right? Joseph was a slave, but Joseph was free. And Joseph was free in the sense that he refused to accept that his brothers, the Egyptians or the Ishmaelites, determined his destiny. He lived as if God determined his destiny in spite of those people, which means this: we must never underestimate the power of a measured response, because you and I have no idea what hangs in the balance of our decision to respond rather than to react. Now, if you don't know Joseph's story, you might expect the next part to be where everything starts to get better. you would be wrong. You might think his brothers would feel guilty. Go find him, bring him home, confess what they had done, and make things right. None of that happened. In fact, it got even harder. And this is important, right? Because sometimes we assume that if we respond the right way, we come to church on Sunday, we say the prayer, sing the song, clap our hands, God and life will immediately reward us for it. But often, isn't it true? One challenge is followed by another. What happened next in Joseph's life was not a reward for his faithfulness. It was another test of it. And this is where Joseph's story starts to connect with all of us. Genesis 39:6 tells us, Joseph was well-built and handsome. Now imagine how vulnerable and frightening it must have been for him to stand on an auction block, to be treated like property, to have no control over his future. And then the story says that, verse 7, and after a while, Potiphar's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. Now, just so you know, that wasn't a request, it was an order. Joseph was trapped in a situation where it probably felt like there was no good outcome. If he gave in, he could lose everything. If he refused, he could still lose everything. And maybe Joseph wondered, what's the point of doing the right thing anyway? What's the point of trusting God if life just keeps getting harder? But once again, Joseph used a superpower. And in verse 8, we again see who he is. But he refused. Cliffhanger. That's where we're going to pick up the story next week in part 2 of the series. But in the meantime, here's what I want you to think about. Whether life is going well or really hard or somewhere in between, how would someone like you with your circumstances respond if they were confident God was with them? How would they respond at school, at work, at home? How would they respond in that difficult friendship, in that strained marriage, in that complicated family situation, or in that season when they feel disappointed, overlooked, afraid, or stuck? How would they respond if they believed they were not alone? Now here's the deal, right? Look, you don't have to commit to anything right now. You just think about it. Because, listen, your circumstances will whisper to you that you have no choice but to react. But what would it look like to push back against what your circumstances are telling you and instead respond as though God is with you? What would it look like to use your superpower, your ability to respond with wisdom, courage, grace, and faith? I'm just telling you, when you choose that path, you make room for God to do something unexpected. Now, you may not always get the ending you want. You may not always see everything come together neatly. But God has a way of redeeming pain and using hard seasons for good and writing a bigger story than we can see in this moment. And somewhere along the way, someone may remember you. Not because you reacted the way everyone else would have, but because you responded differently. Because you chose courage over fear, grace over bitterness, and hope over despair. You see, that's why this question matters so much. It's an invitation every single day to use your superpower, your ability to respond and to live with the confidence that God is with you. Listen to this song.